Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along tonight to this online author talk by Moonee Valley Libraries. My name is Hannah, and I'm the online engagement librarian at Moonee Valley. So we might just give it another minute or so while people are still coming in. All right, so tonight's talk, as you know, is with Mark Mordue in conversation with Claire Halliday about Mark's book, Boy on Fire, The Young Nick Cave. Before I go any further, I would like to respectfully acknowledge on behalf of Moonee Valley City Council, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded land the library stands on and from where we're broadcasting tonight. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, ancestors, spirits, and community members, past and present. And I would extend that acknowledgement and welcome to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or other First Nations people who are here tonight. Thank you for joining us. So I'll hand over to Mark and Claire. Mark Mordue is an acclaimed poet, journalist, writer, and editor. Boy on Fire is his second book on Nick Cave after the 2012 Tinder Prey, and it has received amazing reviews so far. And Claire is also a writer, a speaker, and a frequent interviewer of library events, ours and others. And her book, Things My Mother Taught Me, was published in 2016. Please welcome Claire and Mark.
Hey.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks to Moonee Valley Library for hosting tonight. Mark's joining us from Sydney, and probably there's people joining us from all over, who knows. I'm in Melbourne, and it's just good to be here online and with authors, you know, having the opportunity to talk to audiences. So thanks to everyone who's tuned in. Now, we are here with Mark Mordue talking about his biography on Nick Cave, Boy on Fire. And I just wanted to start welcoming you, Mark, with a congratulations, because you've been shortlisted, your book's been shortlisted for the ABIA, the Australian Book Industry Awards, Best Biography. I think that's coming up on the 28th of April. Congratulations. What does that feel like?
Good.
And?
It's in the book, the Australian Book Design Awards as well, for Hazel Lamb, who designed it. So I'm on a kind of daily double possibility. But, you know, I mean, because when you get down to shortlists, it gets pretty competitive. So I'm thinking that maybe, I'm not expecting to win, but it's nice to be there. It's a bit like the Grammys, you know, like maybe I should, you know, thank God and say I just channeled it all and pretend I'm Prince or someone, although that's maybe not the best person to pretend to be. But anyway.
Not right now, no, not for a few years anyway.
Yeah, it's you know, it's a good thing. It's nice to be recognised, because the Australian Book Industry Awards are obviously peer judged. It's publishers, booksellers, people very closely involved and deeply a part of the literary industry. So yeah, it's good.
Now, I don't presume when you start to write a book like this that you set out with this aim, oh, I'm going to get shortlisted for, you know, this award. But you obviously set out to write a great book. What was your intention for this book when you first thought of it all those years ago? What did you think would happen? What was your hope for it?
I mean, it was mentioned before that there was a previous book. There wasn't. This book has come out of the collapse and kind of failure to write the previous project. My ambition, I would say, was to change the face of what biography is and what biography might mean. So that was possibly a little bit pitching high, but that was what I wanted to do. I mean, all the more so because rock and roll biographies tend to be pretty bad for the most part. Now and again, you'll hit a really great one, like the Nick Tosh's one on Elvis, not on Elvis, on Jerry Lee Lewis, Hellfire. It starts with a great sequence between Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis, and it's like some out of it messy dream, just a brilliant sort of beginning. And I really like the Will Hem's book about Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, which is based from the Talking Heads song, and that's almost like a biography of the city of New York in the 70s, which gave me a lot of confidence to make the book not just about Nick, but a kind of social, cultural landscape biography as well of the times and the places, and effectively an artist growing up in the 60s and 70s and everything and everybody around him. And so I guess you can still sense that big ambition, despite the fact that instead of writing an entire whole life biography, I kind of brought it back down and sliced it off into this thing that's a portrait of the artist, a young man. It's about Nick growing up, and it's about his teenage years in Melbourne and his first serious band, The Boys Next Door, that evolved into the birthday party and the Crystal Ballroom scene. And it's about a lot of things. And so the scope of my ambition is still there in this tighter enterprise. And in some ways, it's maybe better than I imagined it, because I wanted to do so much and even probably say too much. And I just could not get it all into one book. So it's actually, despite all the difficulties along the way, it's kind of become something better, I think.
Okay. Now, you said yourself, it's not just the portrait of the artist as a boy and then as a young man. It's sort of a story about an Australian cultural experience of its time, the Australian childhood in those moments. And for Nick, it was obviously a country upbringing as well. Yet recently the book's been released, I think, already in the UK and also in the US. Were you at all worried about how they might take to that kind of story, such an Australian story?
Yeah, totally. I was expecting the not expecting, but nervous that the book would be rejected in England because the story was just too Australian, and the amount of detail about life in Wangaratta and the whole kind of Melbourne art punk, rock and roll scene of the 70s. I was thinking, gee, is this going to translate? But in fact, I've been really lucky. Like I've got rave reviews, almost better reviews and enthusiasm than I've had here. Like getting write-ups saying that it's a masterpiece and things like this, which is kind of like, oh wow, hey, I quite like that. So the curiosity has about, it's obviously to do with Nick and a curiosity and a hunger for his roots. One thing I always knew is that all this Australian material is rare. Like there have been, two previous biographies about Nick. The most well-known one is The Bad Seed by Ian Johnson. But all the stuff that's about Nick, he's such a saturated and written about figure, but it's all overseas. So the access that I had to Nick's family here, to very old friends here, going to Wangaratta, visiting Melbourne as often as I did, all of that stuff is almost unknown, certainly in any intimate way. And also, Nick's only a year or two older than me. So I've kind of lived that cultural life as well. And that was the strange thing about writing this sort of biography about Nick. There was an element of self-portraiture in it as well, because I was soaked in all this stuff that had affected Nick too. And that gave me a lot of advantages. Anyway, yeah, so the response in the UK has just been fantastic, like beyond anything I could have hoped for.
You said that it gave you a lot of advantages, the fact that you're close to him in age and you're sort of soaking in some of this same culture that he experienced. What were the disadvantages of that? Were you a fan? Did you feel too close to his music to critically examine him as a person?
No, that was not a problem, because I wasn't, I always had a lot of respect for Nick's work, but I wasn't an obsessed fan, and there are plenty of those around. It's a really strange thing with Nick. Like, he's such a polarizing artist, and sometimes when I look at the resentment and even hatred of Nick, and this love of Nick that is almost like a kind of religious worship, they're almost the same thing, like two sides of the same coin. And so there's a strange connection there, as there always is in any form of extremism. But for me, writing, I think, is by its very nature, sooner or later, a cool art, right? Because even if you write with heat and passion, the next day or before you publish, you look at the work, you shape it, you change the wording, you shift the tone, you withdraw things, you intensify things. And it's like that Graham Greene thing of the chip of ice in the writer's heart. So that detachment in the process was, I think, for me, an asset. I mean, the problem is almost the opposite. Rather than being too enthusiastic, becoming too cold and harsh. And you have to be careful of that sort of more kind of alienated cruelty in your processes. But, you know, I mean, there were records of Nick's that had been a real part of my life, like, you know, early birthday party stuff, From Her to Eternity, living, oh God, I'm stumbling on my words.
Let Love In.
Thank you. Let Love In. Your Funeral, My Trial, I was really big on. And I mean, of course, new stuff keeps coming, you know, like I really loved Ghostine recently. I think that's a great album too. And yeah, so it's, I know your relationship in a biography with your subject is a strange thing. When we started, I actually joked with Nick and said, hey, man, you know that all biographies start off as romances and end up as divorces. And to some extent, that prediction came true, as it often comes true for most biographers. So, you know, and I always kind of knew that could well be the case, because I studied not just rock and roll and music, but during the project and before it, I looked into biography and all its problems and dilemmas and ethical encounters, the works. So yeah, you know, so removal or involvement, either end of that polarity, and I was aware of the dangers and tried to kind of find a kind of tight middle path.
So you mentioned the relationship between the writer and the subject, and often, you know, in many cases with biographies, the writers are writing them after the person's long gone, but obviously Nick Cave's very much alive, and you did have a relationship of sorts with him. So for those who haven't heard you talk about that before, I'd love you to explain just what that relationship looked like, and how you first reached out to him, approaching him with the idea, and sort of what transpired from there to get it to this point of publication.
Okay, well, it's kind of complicated and convoluted story. The idea was actually put to me by another writer friend, Jack Marks, and I went, nah, I don't want to do that. I don't want to subsume my life under someone else's life. You know, and then I thought about it, and I thought, well, I have interviewed Nick, you know, quite a few times, and I've seen them every time. Pretty much they've toured here, and you know, I've met and interviewed the German filmmaker Wim Wenders, and I've met and interviewed Mick Harvey, who was Nick's first great collaborator, and I've interviewed Warren Ellis, who is currently now Nick's other great sort of collaborator, and I've followed the career of Roland S. Howard, and I knew this filmmaker and that artist, and I thought, oh my God, I know everybody. So I decided, yeah, I should really do this. That's a great idea. And of course, everybody was very keen. There was a huge amount of interest in the publishing industry. I signed a deal to do a full-length biography, and within a couple of years, I was in big trouble. Right? I'd spent my advance. I was in a place of financial crisis, really. That was the biggest problem. And just everything started to kind of collapse around me. And the main issue was I just could not get everything I wanted to say into one book. And instead of proceeding forward by yards, I was getting forward by inches, if I can use those old imperial measurements. And and deadlines kept getting postponed, and things just kept getting worse and worse on every level. So, you know, like a kind of life crisis really occurred, and relationship collapse, completely busted, broke, so sort of dysfunctional really on a life level. And so I had to kind of just recalibrate and reconstruct my life in order to even live and work, you know, let alone kind of devote myself again to a major project. And along the way, I had suggested to my previous publishers that I felt there was enough there for a portrait of the artist as a young man, but understandably, that was not the deal I'd signed, and that was not what they wanted. So things were just left in this mire. And eventually I kind of came out of that sort of spiral and was able to sort of get working on the book again. And I felt that idea of a portrait of the artist as a young man was still good, still very effective. In fact, the idea had gotten better and stronger. And in the meantime, you know, like I'd obviously contacted Nick. I'd met him many times. He'd agreed to the project. He never wanted it to be authorised, but he gave me access to his family, to you know, old friends, to the Bad Seeds, to former members of the birthday party that were still alive, which was Mick Harvey and Phil Calvert, both of whom were just really fantastic, like so helpful. And you know, so I'd had all this access, and eventually, of course, you know, after about 8 years, 7 or 8 years, it's like, well, is Mark ever going to finish this thing? And I can see how there was like a loss of faith. You know, I would have given up long ago. And also what had happened was Nick's son, Arthur, had died. So that kind of wrought very big changes. And Nick felt that he was a different person. So he wanted me to stop. The thing is, at the time he wanted me to stop, which was about a year after Arthur had died, that was just when I would kind of had finally pulled myself together and the wheels were back on the project and everything was beginning to happen again. So we went from a kind of semi-authorised and friendly relationship. And I must say, during that phase when everything just went belly up, Nick was really great. You know, like he would ring me to check on how I was doing. He, you know, like indicated sometimes that he didn't really care about the book. He just wanted me to be okay. And then other times he'd say, how's that fucking book going, Mordue? But he was really good about it, but very, very generous, very kind, and beyond patient. So, you know, so anyway, so there was that very long muddy period of a couple of years. And then Nick and I basically argued. He wanted to protect his family. I wanted to sort my life out and also protect my family on the basis of, you know, what all the work I had done. And so we diverged. And then just prior to the book coming out, Nick had kind of cooled down and gave me permission for lyrics use, and things had sort of dropped into a more neutral space. But I know for a fact he really loved the chapter in the book on Wangaratta and told me that it had sort of surprised and moved him, and that he was, and then he wrote me a really nice email after the book came out, telling me that the book was great, that he really loved it and really appreciated it, which is really big of him, because there's things in the book that I know he couldn't love, that would be annoying or angering. And really, in the end, if Nick had written a biography about me, would I like it? Probably not, because it's not me. It's only Nick's vision of me, and same in reverse. I'm not Nick. It's a version. And often in these conversations, the one I'm having with you, but people ask me questions, and there's a strange line where I feel as if I'm being asked what Nick thinks or what Nick is, as if I were Nick, but I'm not that being. I've just had this privileged intimacy over a long period of time, and it's a mix of that contact and the quotes and all the interviews, and then a funny mix of intuition and feeling and imagination. And you know, it's far from definitive. It's just a version.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, obviously, being the portrait of the artist as a young man, it does explore, you know, his childhood in Wangaratta that you mentioned. But I think you quote somebody in the book as saying it's not so much being brought up in Wangaratta that defined him, it was leaving Wangaratta. And what can you tell me about that? What can you tell me about Nick's leaving of that town and his relationship with it now?
Okay, well, I think again that's a complicated story. I mean, that quote comes from a best friend at the time, a guy called Brian Wellington, who has since passed away, sadly. I mean, a couple of people died during the process of writing the book, including Nick's mother at the very end, just before it came out, Dawn, who was incredibly helpful. and a fantastic woman, and really kind and generous to me. There's a lot of truth to what Brian said. I don't think it's entirely true. I think Nick was deeply affected by his upbringing in Wangaratta and by the landscape, and you feel it in an affectionate and kind of beautiful, mysterious way in a song like Sad Waters. I mean, that's the river in Wangaratta and all the time Nick spent down there, as well as the early sort of boyhood romance that he felt, even if it wasn't real. A lot of his relationship to Wangaratta, which he says himself is not so much the actuality of it as his remembering of it. And I know at times he's made sort of sarcastic remarks here and there, but I think there's a profound love for Wangaratta, and it's a kind of dreaming place, as it so often is for all of us. Our childhood and our adolescence are these dreams that keep sort of fueling us, and they're places we go to try and understand ourselves, and they're places we go to energize ourselves. But eventually Nick had to leave Wangaratta. He was made to leave Wangaratta. He was sent away when he was 12, 13 years old to Melbourne, to boarding school. And he basically was just a really brilliant, difficult young kid who was getting more and more unruly, more and more trouble. His father was a teacher at the school, Colin Cave, and a very notable figure around town, indeed the whole state, in terms of running the adult education centre. His mother, Dawn, was a librarian. So there was all these sort of difficulties of how enmeshed education and Nick's behaviour was. And he was on the borders of being expelled. So they felt they were doing the right thing. But Nick was wounded by that, for sure. And I don't think his experiences of going to Melbourne, to Caulfield and boarding were particularly pleasant, you know. I mean,
no, there's a written book that I wanted to read about that, where you describe his arrival into boarding school. I'll just read a paragraph or two.
Oh.
You say, skinny and awkward, like some goofy fallen bird, he must have looked an easy mark for bullying. Closer examination would have revealed broad shoulders, a country boy's sinewy strength, and dauntingly large hands that were as good as clubs when he formed them into fists. Cave had something else too in his favour when it came to defending himself. What might be called a killer instinct, a way of never giving up no matter what odds were stacked against him. So you've touched upon elements of his childhood, what his dad did for a living, what his mum did for a living, but what were the ingredients in Nick's life that gave him that particular attitude that you describe? And how important is that aspect of him to the success that he's since achieved in the music world?
Well, I think they're very important things, you know. I mean, Nick was already having conflicts with his father. Like, his father was Colin Cave was quite a driven figure. And if Nick was not now so famous, Nick would probably be known as Colin Cave's son, because Colin Cave really sort of transformed the nature of, which I was kind of mentioning before, adult education in the state. He was an absolutely dynamic and life-changing school teacher, teaching English. He was also a major figure in community theatre, and every town he went to, Warracknabeal initially, and then Wangaratta lately, and then down in Melbourne at the Malvern Theatre, he was a dynamo. And his interest in literature, which Nick has talked about, whether it's Nabokov or Shakespeare or Dostoevsky, were all critical influences on Nick. And I think his father's influences are, and because of theatre, his interest in performing especially, I think that opened up a sensibility to Nick that a lot of other people didn't have. So, but there was friction, you know, there was a competitiveness. There was the classic father-son energy. And, you know, I mean, the book culminates with the unexpected death of Colin Cave. I hope I'm not being too much of a spoiler with that, but it's fairly common knowledge. And that trauma kind of was what it never got a chance. The relationship never got a chance to be resolved. In the meantime, on the other side, you have Dawn, who's just this really, you know, beautiful woman, you know, lovely mother, great sense of humour, and also because she's a librarian, she's a very literary figure. Like, I'd go around to her house and be able to have a rave with her about W.H. Auden or T.S. Eliot, these kind of things, you know, like, so she was a classically trained violinist. So there's all these more tender, humorous, softer influences. I mean, it gets too cliched to narrow it down to father driven and possessed, mother, soft and human, but it is a bit like that. Those forces are there, but I think there are these. Nick talks about Auden and the relationship between a wound and creativity, and certain wounds happened at certain times. To be forced out of Wangaratta by his father and his mother supporting the decision, but it felt like his father. That was a wounding thing. So he's traumatically sort of torn from his childhood and his childhood landscape, basically, and left boarding on his own. Very big thing in Nick's life. He reunites with the family in Melbourne when they move back there only a year or so later. But the hurt and the conflicts with the father set in, and that just builds and builds and builds like a nuclear reactor. And then the accident occurs and Nick's father dies just as the boys at next door are really starting to kind of happen. Just prior to actually to Nick recording Door Door and the song Shivers. So literally weeks before. So there's all this stuff brewing, and you can kind of get sort of Freudian about it or whatever. And Nick has remarked upon it an awful lot across his life, but there's a lot of hurt there, and a very deep sense by the time he's leaving Australia after his father's accident, a very profound sense of his relationship to loss and to death.
You mentioned the meetings with Dawn Cave, and you can tell there's a real tenderness there that you had sweet interactions, but obviously she's a very interesting woman, not just some sweet little old lady. It was a big thing for Nick to even sort of give permission for you to speak to her, because she's somebody that he's kept sort of out of the spotlight a little bit when it comes to interviewing about his own background. Did she see any sort of early drafts or the quotes that you were going to use from her? Because obviously she did die before the book was published. Had she seen it in any form?
No, nor had Nick. Nick didn't want to look at the book at the end. He just wanted to be separate from the whole process, which is probably a wise decision. Like Dawn was such a kind of charismatic and intelligent and warm person that I was more nervous about how she might receive the book than how Nick would receive the book. I expected Nick to have mixed feelings, and Nick can be kind of pretty intense, so I expected more conflict than what actually came, and that was fine with me. But with Dawn, it was like to feel that I might have disappointed her would be the same as disappointing my own mother, right? It was that kind of a feeling, because she had been so kind, so generous, and was such an intelligent and insightful person as well, that her judgments would be something that would have definitely affected me. So a part of me is sort of relieved that I don't have to, but I don't have to deal with that. But I would have liked her to see it, and I would hope that the book would be something she would see in a positive light, as Nick does. And Nick is her son. It was always clear to me that she just loved him to the max and was a fantastic influence on him, and indeed a really big influence, which is a strange thing to say, but a really big influence on the boys next door on the birthday party, because she's just one of those people who provides a second home and an emanation of warmth to all who came her way,
But obviously when you are setting out to write a biography, you're not just looking for all the good quotes from all the positive people, because then it just ends up being like a fan tribute. So how did you choose or select in the end whose quotes you would use, who you would even interview to start with? How did you find that balance of all the different opinions of Nick over the years?
Wow, boy. I mean, that's how I got lost. I just spoke to everybody. And so, I mean, I spoke to all the main figures. Clearly, I spoke to Nick, I spoke to Dawn, I spoke to Nick's brother Tim and his sister Julie. I spoke to old school friends, including Brian Wellington. I spoke to the living members of the Boys Next Door, which was Mick Harvey and Phil Calvert, who were absolutely essential. So there's, I guess you could say, there was an essential spectrum, and then there are all the wider constellation where I was seeking to kind of get not just a picture of Nick, but the landscapes that he was in, and get an understanding of Wangaratta as a town, and get an understanding of Melbourne in the 70s and the Crystal Ballroom scene in particular, and all the things that drove it, from sort of art and music to drugs and that world. So, to put it together, wow, well, I mean, you're always looking for kind of narrative possibilities, and it's a strange thing writing a book, because often after you've spoken to a few people, you have a lot of the essential ingredients, but then you need sort of textures to give it a cinematic intimacy, for example. So if you're looking for minor details, but people can be annoyed by that because they think you're looking for gossip, or you're looking for sort of idiotic sort of things but you're actually looking for the detail and the texture that can create an experience of being there in the place. And people can help in the kind of oddest and strangest ways in that regard, with just a bit of a small bit of information that pulls you right into a scene. And the other thing about it, which I kind of have rambled away from, but in terms of people who liked or disliked Nick, that made it all the more interesting. I didn't need to define or say who was right or wrong. It was more interesting to have these competing views and create a sort of constellation around Nick and around those worlds he passed through, where people had different, even utterly contradictory views. When it was contradictory, from my perspective, that was great, because it makes everything feel more alive. It's as if people are still not settled on what happened and what was going on, and it kind of brings more to the reader, so the reader can look at these different facets and make their own interpretations about it. I mean, and I think this actually has a bearing on our present reality in terms of how absolutely definite everybody is about people, what they are, who they are. People seem to be fixed on a board like butterflies, as if they are just a single thing in terms of what their identity is or what they did. But of course, life is complicated, and it's in a panorama, and it's changing. And I wanted to capture that, even within A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I wanted everything to be alive and to be difficult, and to be everything from beautiful to ugly, from funny to profound, and to just have it all stirring and seething. That was what I really sought. So I didn't need to paint Nick as a great guy, and I didn't need to paint him as a bad guy. I just needed to paint him in a way that was interesting and dynamic, which he is. And I needed to make sure I got all the facts and details culturally and physically in terms of places correct.
I'd love an example of that, if you can think of one off the top of your head, that detail that you say might have seemed like, you're seeking something inconsequential or gossipy, but it's that little detail that suddenly opens this door and takes you somewhere else and gives you a really deeper understanding of people in that moment. Does something come to mind?
Yeah, I'm just looking for it. It was the one that really appealed to me was their first manager. Sorry for the. I'm just looking for the reference if I can read it out. Their first manager was a woman called Karen Marks, and they got an offer from another guy, Barry All, to sign up to Suicide Records, and he also offered to be their manager as well, even though he's running the record label, so complete conflict of interest. But anyway, so they went round to let Karen Marks know that her services were no longer required. And when it was actually one of the last interviews I did at the very end of things, and she told me how her descriptions of Nick and his girlfriend at the time, and really his great inspiration and a big influence, Anita Lane, her descriptions of them as these sort of surly adolescents is pretty funny. But when she was talking about, Nick was the one who basically sacked her, and she talked about him eating twisties. And as soon as she said that, I was like, oh man, fantastic. Like that little detail of him popping twisties with acne, sitting at the table, being very kind of punk and surly, and him and Anita just sitting there, not giving anything to her. I just thought, oh, that's just these sort of basically these kind of nasty, arrogant adolescents giving her the boot, having their twisties in front. I thought, oh, that's such a great scene. So that kind of detail, you're really pleased when you get it. But sometimes in the interview process, so that was just given to me outright. But at times when you're trying to chase up these kind of specifics, people just think, why the hell do you want to know about what chip packet he was eating? But that's actually the stuff that brings people in. And we're literally just talking about one word or half of a sentence. But it's the same way that cinema works, where it pulls you into a close-up and the big stuff's happening, but the texture roots you in the scene.
Absolutely. Now, it's nearly time for questions from the audience, so hopefully people who are listening have a few questions they can send your way. We do have one that I'll be asking off the bat, but before we get to that question, I wanted to ask something that will sort of lead into it. We've talked about the Australianness of this book and how it is really, exploring the Australian childhood. As Nick's grown, beyond the pages of this book, he seems to be somebody who's been happy to hold on to that Australianness. And I was wondering, just from what you see of him now, why you think that's so important for him to hold on to that, whereas others would let that go and sort of shun where they've come from. He really holds on to it.
It's actually kind of more complicated and oscillating than that. I think he was definitely kind of leaving it behind him. And I mean, in a lot of ways, Nick despite his love of Americana, he's become a very, very European artist. I just think that and to some extent, I think now in the last few years, he's both more deeply engaged with the world in political ways, particularly environmental concerns, in my interpretation of his work. But also sort of leaving the world into this sort of spiritual dimension. Leaving the world is maybe the wrong way to put it, but the activity is happening in another world. So he's kind of taking this world with him and trying to venture into a spiritual dimension, which obviously connects to the death of his son and a sort of desire to somehow communicate with him and his own pain and the pain of those he loves around him. So, I mean, there's many things there to converse about, but I do think there is this thing that we all know as we get older, that our youth becomes more important to us, and we're in a sort of dialogue with our childhood and our youth to just understand who we are and to kind of deepen who we are, because in a way, when you become an adult, you let the child in you sort of die, or you try to kill the child off because you want to be cool, you want to be grown up, all these things, and you do it with drugs and you do it with art, And then when you get older, you realize, well, that's a kind of fatal move. It's like the fable of the young, brilliant prince who comes to the city, and it's going to be so hard and so tough. Nothing will get him, nothing will affect him, nothing will corrupt him. And he gets harder and tougher, harder and tougher, harder and tougher. And then people say, what happened to the young, beautiful prince? And they go, well, he's just like everybody else now. And I think Nick definitely suffered from that. And I think he has pulled back from that. And I think that compassion and kindness and becoming a more fully realised and compassionate human being are really his goals, as they should be and are for all of us. And that's the wisdom of getting older if you haven't battered yourself into a heap.
Now, we have got some questions coming through, and the first one, as I said, was one that came through a little bit earlier, following on from what I just touched on there. From your research, this is from Kevin, from your research of the young Nick Cave, were there any indications that he would leave Australia to live in the UK?
There were certainly indications he would leave. Oh my God, like there was just this hunger for everything from overseas, you know, like whether he was as a painter, like loving the works of I'm trying to think of his name. Is it Francis Bacon? I think that's the
yes, yep.
Or is it Francis? No, it's the Bacon, the violent English painter. To his love of Jimi Hendrix and Alice Cooper, and then the punk stuff that was happening with the Ramones in particular, and then his worship of David Bowie, especially, who's a huge career model for Nick as much as anything else. And like Nick was, as we all were at that time, like overseas was this place where everything seemed to be occurring, and Australia was just this wasteland where there was nothing. And there was all the more nothing if you were a kind of creative or odd or unusual, and you felt there was room to be a bigger and different and more exciting person overseas. So yeah, it was always there, there's a chapter in the book on Wangaratta when he's just a young teenager, and he's in a room with his friends, and they're listening to Leonard Cohen's Songs of Love and Hate. And I think the music is not just an influence; it's a dream of entering into this imaginary world as much as a real world, an imaginary world. So, yeah, he was always going to go.
We've got another question. It's from Kaz. She says, thanks, Mark. Can you tell us a bit more about how you negotiated the story with your publisher towards the portrait of the young man? What was your pitch?
Well, my pitch was to do the whole book, and then I didn't do that. And then they hated me and were really frustrated. Well, maybe they didn't hate me, but they certainly weren't happy with me. And the whole thing collapsed, and I had to get a new publisher. So I had to find a new set of people to go with me and to help me out of the hole I was in. My original publishers did say that the book had some of the best non-fiction writing they'd ever seen. Like it wasn't, but it was just not the book that they had that I had signed the contract for. Like I hadn't delivered that, and I was nowhere near close to delivering it. So it was just like, what the hell do we do? And then I just became a real mess with it. So, and like I say, it took me more than a couple of years, to sort of piece myself back together and rejoin the biography. And I've said this before, but often what gets in the road of biographies is your own life rather than the life that you're looking at. And that was certainly the case with me. I think that, Nick is a vast subject. It's not often that a subject comes along like that. So, and I was lucky that I'd just been writing about rock and roll and art and music for 30 plus years, that I had all these connections, that I'd met most of the people, and I was very familiar with the cultural material, and I was of a similar vintage. So I'd lived a similar life in a parallel kind of way. So there are all these assets, and I'd established a name for myself as a writer, because I suspect behind that there's a question about how one gets published. And I think the answer to that is you have to build up. You have to choose, have a good subject. That's never hurts. And in my case, I had a very good subject and I had access to him. But also I'd established a name of my own as well. So there's some credibility in that.
Now we've got another question from Indigo. And so she says, following Arthur's death, did you find that your own relationship to the material of Nick's younger life and your shaping of the narrative shifted in any way?
It made me more aware of the material. I actually didn't need to really do that much to it. It was more a matter of my relationship to Nick, but for sure all that material had all these inherent qualities to it, because it maps the journey of a boy and a young man to the edge of his maturity and his possibility. So it's probably not so much that I did anything particularly explicit, and I didn't really want to overdo any connections like that. But there is a feeling there, and a recognition of the echoes. So yeah, I just felt, I've got kids too, and I often think about this with Nick. When people are so famous and iconic, even when you've met them, it's easy to forget the reality of something and how profound that is for them as human beings. And, I do not know a single parent who would want to have their children die before them in any way, in any form. No. So if it did anything, it made me aware of the need for delicacy, which is not the same thing as compromising your vision. I think in many ways I was, at times in the book, I'm quite savage with regard to Nick, but just to be fair, maybe that's the only word, just to be fair, and to understand that across a person's life, a lot of things can happen. And I mean, Nick's a bit like a cat, like he's had 9 lives, and this is another thing that makes me think about our present day savagery online and through identity politics and all, like that people can be many things across their life. They can live beautifully, they can live horribly, they can be confused and lost, then they can be back together again and be all the more beautiful again. And so that is the kind of journey that interests me in regard to Nick's life, and trying to deal with a part of that life with respect to those other parts.
You mentioned before, the parallels that you've had in ways of your life and Nick's life growing up as Australian young men. I'm just wondering, having immersed yourself in such an in-depth exploration of the portrait of the artist as the young man, what happened in his life to make him who he is today, how has that process made you examine your own life and elements of your own childhood and different aspects of your own pivotal age milestones to get to where you are now?
I don't know if it made me examine it any more than I already do. Maybe it caused more to be unearthed, because I was writing a lot of material that was about that stuff, so it made me. It's not so much that it changed anything necessarily, so much as it just stirred up more. Like I've mentioned this before too, but I just remember being in Wangaratta, sitting in the park under a tree, a really big tree, like scary big, that Nick used to climb with his friends, and his family home was literally just down the road. I could almost see it. and the local swimming pool was on the other side of the park. And I thought about my own childhood and youth in Newcastle and going to my local swimming pool and living in a similar place that was basically residential, but on the borders of sort of, a semi-commercial district with warehouses and factories, like right on, because Nick's house is kind of on that sort of edge of town part of things, like his family home then. And I just could not believe it. I thought, God, like I could have. This is like where I grew up, and it wasn't the same, but many similarities. It's like that scene in the film Capote, where Truman Capote talks about Percy, Perry rather, who's the killer. So that's maybe the best comparison. And he says it's as if Perry went out through the back door and I went out through the front. That's what Truman Capote says. Well, maybe it's a bit reversed with Nick and I, but not really. But there was just some almost eerie sense of like knowing this stuff and knowing this place. Talking to people sometimes, I mean, they do remark upon this with Nick, this weird, almost cosmic energy sort of occurring, these sort of coincidences. And I guess people out there who are Carl Jung fans might understand some of this a bit more, but there is a strange sort of resonating sense of Nick's life and its way of vibrating into your life that's really sort of kind of powerful. And that was actually the great thing about the book, and that is the thing I'm proudest about the book. His life pulls in so much around him, and and what I've written, I would like to think it's about Nick, but it's about so much more than Nick. It's about growing up in Australia. It's about becoming an artist. It's about parts of our history. It's about a whole lot of people and their dreams and hopes and failures and successes. And so it's about all these social scenes. And so even if people aren't into Nick at all or don't like him, I would really hope if they actually read the book, they would be involved in it and even surprised.
I think that's a beautiful way to get this towards its closing. But there is a question from Mark, which I'm sure a lot of other people are thinking this too, because you've mentioned that you originally wanted to do the book on Nick's entire life. So Mark's question is, will there be another book following Nick into the 1980s and beyond?
Yeah, well, I've been talking to my publishers about this, and heaps of people have obviously been asking me. And I was really wary of this at first because the book just caused me a lot of hurt and damage, as well as the success that I'm having with it now. But I've got easily enough material to do London and Berlin, which is probably the most sort of ferocious and wild part of Nick's career. And I would really like to do that. So, yeah, I'm going to do a volume 2 that will probably focus pretty much around that period, which is basically the birthday party in London and Nick establishing himself with the Bad Seeds and as a solo artist in Berlin, or as a kind of global cult superstar, and really kind of creating sort of a series of signature works for himself that would kind of put him on the map. So I'd love to do that and sort of end it in or around that sort of Sao Paulo kind of period. That's what I'm thinking. And the good thing about it is it's a defined period. Like, I'm not trying to do everything. Obviously, I would reference other things. So, but don't run up to the bookstore to see if it's there next week. Give me 2 years and I'll be back, as Arnold Schwarzenegger says.
Now, Kevin has popped back in with another question for you. We've still got a couple of minutes, so I hope you don't mind answering it. And I'm going to expand upon it a little bit with my own question. So Kevin's question is, does Mark have a favourite Nick Cave song? They go on to say that their own favourite one is Into Your Arms. So my expansion on that is, I'd love to hear too what your favourite Nick Cave song is, but I'm wondering if your favourite Nick Cave song changed and evolved with that, greater understanding, that greater exploration of the person that he is that created that music.
Well, Nick's got so much work. I think it probably changes. And in fact, Nick has so much stuff, I forget stuff, and then I hear something and go, oh, wow, that's good. I'd forgotten that it was even there and how good it was. But I seem to return a lot to Magneto, actually, which is on Skeleton Tree. And I like its eeriness, and I like its pain and its sadness as well as its beauty. So that one really appeals to me a lot. It used to be Stranger Than Kindness, which is actually written by Anita Lane and Blixa Bargeld, and that's a pretty sort of eerie, strange song as well. It's like a kind of Tennessee Williams sort of dream, dark dream set to music. So I do like that quality in Nick's work when it moves into this sort of dream zone. Do You Love Me Part 2 is another one that's pretty amazing too, and it's the same thing. It's very dark, and it's almost left this world, but of course it hasn't, because it's so full of the world's disturbed energies. So they're beautiful and strange and painful. I like that side of Nick's work a lot.
Now, for the people that have already read Boy on Fire, and I hope most people tuning in have, or if they haven't, they should contact their local library or buy it from bookstore and get it. But while we are waiting for volume 2, which may or may not come in many years' time, according to you, where else can people follow your writing? Where are you doing other stuff at the moment in between books?
Well, I should be freelancing more than I am. I've been teaching at uni the last 3 months. So I've got a website called The Electrified Journalist, but I'm really slack about kind of posting on it, and slack bordering on hopeless. I should be much more together about that stuff. I do an awful lot of stuff through Facebook, which is stupid of me, but I do. I post a lot of poetry up there. But I think I feel like I've got all this material now. I've done the book, that I've got a novel that my publishers are interested in seeing and possibly publishing. I've got volume 2 that I'm developing. I'd like to do another type of nonfiction work that's a bit more compressed around a particular subject. And I'd love to put together a collection of my journalism of some kind too, in my nonfiction writing, just because I've got so much stuff, there. So that would be great to do too. So I feel like that I've got all these books bursting out of me. In the meantime, just lots of poetry. Some people might be interested in this poetry collection I only published 2 years ago with Transit Lounge, called Darlinghurst Funeral Rites, and that was about my life in Sydney in the 80s and the trade union club scene, and in many ways the funny thing about it is it's almost a kind of little psychic map that helped me to write about the Crystal Ballroom scene and Nick in the 70s and all the things that happened there.
Thank you for that, Mark, and thank you so much for your stories tonight about your own writing and Boy on Fire, your wonderful biography. Best of luck for the ABIA Awards in about a week or so. And now back to Moonee Valley Library and Hannah, because I believe that as we say goodbye, Mark, and thanks to the audience for tuning in, I think the library's got a little poll that they're hoping the audience do. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Claire
Nice
and Mark. It's our pleasure to have you, and we look forward to having you again when your sequel comes out, Mark.
Yeah, look forward to it. Actually being in the world would be good.
Yeah, we'd love to have you in person. So cool. Thank you very much, and thank you, Claire.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.